Today we are going to complete lesson 11.2, adding integers. This is on page 484 of your textbook. Our purpose today is to learn how to add positive and negative integers so we can apply this skill to real-world situations. Okay, there are going to be two rules for adding integers. You do not need to write them down at this time. In a few minutes later on in the video, you'll have an opportunity to pause the video and write the rules down. First, adding integers with the same sign. Okay, when we have the same sign, we add the absolute values of the integers and then keep the sign the same. So, for example, adding positive numbers, no problem. 2 plus 5 equals 7, that you've been doing for years. But if the numbers are both negatives, so for example, -2 plus -5, we add the absolute values, which would be 2 plus 5, and then we keep the negative because they're both negative, so the answer is -7. Okay, so you can also use a number line to check your answers if you'd like. I'm going to show you this process, but I'm not going to require that you use it. So, for example, if we have -2 plus -4, we know it's going to equal -6, but let's check it on a number line. If I started off at 0, right here, and I had -2, it's going to bring my line over to here, and then I add another -4, and that will put my final answer right here at -6. So -2 plus -4 equals -6. Okay, so we've talked already about this, but two numbers that are the same distance from 0 but on opposite sides of 0 are called opposites. For example, -3 and 3 are opposites. So when we're adding integers with different signs, we do have a different rule to follow. So we're going to subtract the lesser absolute value from the greater absolute value, then keep the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. So let's look at some number examples. If I have 8 plus a -10, -10 is the bigger absolute value. So I'm going to start with 10, subtract 8, and my answer is 2. Now, I said earlier that we need to use the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. 10 has the bigger absolute value, so we keep the negative sign. So the answer is -2. Okay, in our other example, -13 minus 17 equals 4. We start with 17 because it has the bigger absolute value. I subtract 13, I get 4, and then I'm going to keep it at a positive 4 because the 17 does not have a negative. Okay, we have another rule we're going to talk about, and it's called the additive inverse. The sum of an integer and its opposite is the additive inverse, and it's always going to be 0. So honestly, this is something that we had talked about quite a while ago, but as a reminder, remember additive inverse is adding opposites, and your answer will always be 0. So the examples, 6 plus a -6 is 0. -25 plus 25 is 0. And the same is true for algebra. If I had a and I was adding to it a -a, the answer would be 0. Okay, so let's take look at a few examples of adding with different signs. So when I add 5 plus a -10, we know that -10 is absolute value of -10 is greater than 5. So we're going to subtract 5 from -10. When I subtract, my answer is 5, and then I need to keep the negative from the 10 because it had the bigger absolute value. So the sum is -5. Okay, with -3 plus 7, this problem was actually on the other page, but 7 is greater than -3, so I subtract at the absolute value of -3 from 7, and I get 4. And it's positive because the 7 has a bigger absolute value, and it's positive. Then the last example, we have a -12 plus 12. This is where our additive inverse rule comes in. We're adding opposites together, when I combine them, I'm going to get 0. So the answer is 0. Okay, as I told you earlier, I am going to have you write these rules down. And later on in future lessons, we'll be adding the rules for computing positive and negative integers for subtraction, multiplication, and division. So as I go through this, please pause the video and add these to your notebook. So the first rule, adding with the same sign. Add the absolute values of the integers and keep the same sign. When we're adding with different signs, we subtract the smaller absolute value from the bigger absolute value and keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. Pause the video while you record these rules. Okay, now we are going to compute a few problems, practice problems together. I want you to pause the video, write 1 through 6 on your paper, and then please write down what you believe the answer would be. Okay, number 1, of course, is 20. Number 2, negative 13. Number 3, negative 35. Number 4 is 9. Number 5 is negative 1. And number 6, we have the additive inverse, so the answer is 0.